Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Not only have I got the misfortune to have written one of the smallest books on the Russian Revolution, I've also got the misfortune of doing one of the saddest meetings at today's events, because we're talking today, aren't we, about celebrating 1917, 100 years on. But in order to celebrate 1917, we also have to be able to explain what went wrong and how all the things that we've talked about so far today, the brilliant things that happened in the Russian Revolution, could turn into the horrors that we saw under Stalin. We have to be able to explain, did Lenin cause this? Did Lenin lead to Stalin? Was it inevitable? Was the revolution doomed from the very beginning? And that's some of the things that I'm going to try to address in the meeting today, to try and help us arm ourselves to address some of these questions. And I want to start really with the beginning and the end of the meeting, if you like, and then I'll move back to the middle. It's an unusual structure. The beginning is, obviously, that I want us all to agree that October 1917 was a workers' revolution, led by the Bolsheviks, representing the majority view of the working class as expressed through the Soviets. And I'm not going to talk about all the brilliant things that they did, even though I really want to. But I think one interesting thing that is relevant to this meeting is to think about what they envisaged the new regime was going to look like. Just weeks after the October Revolution, Lenin urged the workers to deepen the revolution by rebuilding society from below. The way that he put it was, get on with the job, begin right at the bottom, do not wait for anyone. So for the Bolsheviks, who made the revolution with the workers at the helm, workers' democracy would be absolutely key to taking the economy forward and to planning and to creating the new regime. Skip to the end, I want to say that the regime of Stalinism, from 1928 onwards in particular, was an absolute destruction and reversal of all the brilliant things that we've talked about so far in the conference. And we can look at this on any level. There's a meeting currently taking place about the question of oppression and the brilliant liberating things that the Bolsheviks were part of unleashing in 1917, that the revolution really did to try and liberate the oppressed, crushed under Stalin. The gains for national liberation, crushed under Stalin. The flowering of workers' democracy, of new art forms, crushed under Stalin. We can look at this on any kind of level, never mind the fact that actually Stalin had to literally murder most of the people who'd been part of the leadership of making the 1917 revolution in order to bring about the counter-revolution that brought him to power. So that's the start and that's the end. Now let's talk about the middle, because the question is, how could that happen? How could such a brilliant event such as 1917 degenerate and fall into the ruin that we saw with Stalinism? And I want to start with the Bolshevik perspectives, because there have been many people over the last 100 years, actually 100 years ago as well, who argued that the Bolsheviks were wrong in October 1917, that the revolution was premature, that it was unrealistic, that it was never going to work to have a workers' revolution in a country where the majority of people weren't workers. The majority of people in Russia at the time were peasants. The Bolsheviks themselves were not blind to this dilemma. It was the cause of many debates and arguments in the Bolsheviks and in the rest of the left in Russia. And there are several answers to this question, and I'm not going to go into them in detail, but I think you have to say, first of all, that the choices that existed in October were not between workers' revolution or some kind of gradual capitalist development. We've touched on this in other meetings, but between revolution or a right-wing backlash of the most reactionary kind. The second thing, really, that I want to say is that Russia was developing in a way that Leon Trotsky called combined and uneven development. There were concentrations of economically and politically advanced workers that were the centre of the revolution. In actual fact, by 1913, Russia was around the fifth largest industrial economy, but they were characterised by tiny small concentrations, the most concentrated workforce in Europe, the people who would become the centre of the revolution in 1917. But finally, it was absolutely crucial to the Bolsheviks' perspective, from the revolution onwards, that for the revolution in Russia to succeed, it had to spread abroad. And this wasn't romanticism on their part or some kind of, a tokenistic gesture towards internationalism. This was a result of their understanding of Russia's development in the context of the global economy. And being in a country that was majority peasants, where peasants could support the revolution and be an alliance in the desire for bread, peace and land, were central to driving that through in the revolution, but don't have the power to create a new collective ruling class in the way that workers do, that can create the basis for a new socialist society. For a revolution to survive in these circumstances and in a hostile sea of capitalism, it was absolutely essential for the revolution to spread. Now, this was not an unrealistic perspective. The international wave of resistance at the end of the First World War absolutely terrified the ruling class. The British Prime Minister, Lord George, complained that the whole of Europe is filled with the spirit of revolution. There were strikes across industrialised countries, including Britain, France, the US, Canada, Australia. People have talked about the struggles in Ireland. There were revolts in the colonies. There were mutinies in the armies. The spirit of revolution was spreading, and the Bolsheviks were a beacon among that. Here in Britain, in 1919, in Folkestone, 10,000 British soldiers refused to return to France, and instead they chanted, "Come on, you Bolsheviks," which I think just shows that British slogans always seem to sound like football chants to me. We kind of seem to miss some of the lyricism that some of our European comrades seem to manage. Anyway, we can work on that later, comrades. In some countries, this went beyond strike waves to actual serious challenges for state power, including in Austria, including the 2 Red Years in Italy, the brief Soviet governments in Hungary and Bavaria, most significantly of all, the German Revolution, which involved mass action and activity by the working class, created its own Soviets, resulted in repeated challenges to state power in 1918, 1921 and 1923. The Bolsheviks were also not just watching this unfold across the world, they were committed to practical measures to spread the revolution. We talked, I think John Molyneux talked brilliantly about what the Bolsheviks did in Baku, where even in the midst of civil war, they took the risk of travelling across the whole of Russia to be part of the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku that they organised in Azerbaijan in 1920, which had 2,000 delegates from across Asia. They were also part of organising the Third International, the Comintern, founded in 1919, at the time as a small organisation, but by its third Congress in 1921, it was a mass organisation representing communist parties in over 50 countries. And many activists, inspired by what the Bolsheviks did, joined, set up, created new communist parties around the world that would go on to be part of that organisation. Now, it's worth saying here that under Stalin, that organisation that was set up and initially was about spreading revolution actually became degenerated and turned into a wing of Stalinist foreign policy. But at its outset, it was about spreading the revolution, about energising the revolution, about comrades coming together and organising and thinking across international borders. But I don't think it's giving the game away too much here to tell people that unfortunately the revolution didn't spread. I think you may have noticed that we do not live today in a revolutionary republic. And ultimately, the failure of the revolution to spread is what caused the isolation of Russia and was the decisive factor, above all else, I want to argue, about how the revolution was actually lost. And it didn't fail to spread through lack of opportunity or lack of the combativity of working class people in all the examples that I've given, but through mistakes and inexperience of the new communist organisations that were setting up. Organisations who didn't have the years of experience that the Bolsheviks had had of the twists and turns of class struggle and organising in different situations. Chris Harman, in his brilliant article about how the revolution was lost, which is available in full online, describes how these new organisations acted when there was no mass support, and when there was support, they failed to act. Now, it wasn't just that. There were objective differences and problems that some of the new communist organisations faced. They faced some problems that the Bolsheviks didn't have in terms of long-established reformist organisations, the trade unions, the social democrats who were determined to preserve the existing order and wanted to change things just within the limits of capitalism. But it's not true that the Russians and the Bolsheviks never dealt with the questions of reformism. If you think about the whole battle between February to October, we were talking about it in the last session in the meeting on the Bolsheviks, was actually a condensed battle against reformism. But the international isolation, as the revolution failed to spread, is the basis really for everything else that I want to talk about. Because it wasn't just isolation, it was also the international intervention. Obviously, the vested powers in Russia itself were hostile and aggressive, But the white forces, as they were known, were also divided and on the back foot. And what was crucial to sustaining an assault against the new Bolshevik workers' regime was the international intervention from 14 invading armies. He explained it like this in April 1918. He said, "Our internal enemies are pitiful." He went on to say the problem was the all-powerful external enemies who utilise a huge centralised machine for their mass murder and extermination. And the 14 invading armies supplied funding, weapons, advice, troops. But more than that, they gave confidence to the white forces. They helped to resurrect an idea that the rest of the capitalist world was on their side, fighting back against the Bolsheviks. By 1919, there were over 200,000 foreign troops fighting alongside the whites. And at the same time, there was an international blockade to try to starve the revolution, which had a massive impact, actually, on living conditions and material conditions in Russia at the time. The Bolsheviks had to create, pretty much from scratch, a new force to defend the revolution, the Red Army, which was created and led under Trotsky, first from volunteers and then by conscription. And amazingly, through all the twists and turns of the next few years, this new Red Army was victorious against the whites and was able to beat back the imperialist armies and the white oppositionists. Partly this was due to divisions and failures in the white strategies, but mainly this was due to the political imperative of those people who went to fight in the Red Army, because the workers and the peasants who were in the army were fighting to stop the destruction of everything that they had achieved in 1917 and everything that they were defending. And the threat wasn't just to go back to how things were before the revolutionary upsurge. And people knew that. You get a glimpse, really, of what was at stake when you see some of the horrific atrocities that were committed by the whites in the period of the Civil War. I don't really call it a civil war because it was an attempt at regime change from imperialist armies, but we call it traditionally the Civil War. You see what was at stake when you look at the level of anti-Semitic violence that the white armies used, when you look at how white pogroms against the Jews killed up to 100,000 Jewish people at this time. There are still photographs that survive from some of the atrocities that the whites carried out, like the one from August 1919 that shows groups of white Cossacks posing over a row of dead Jewish people wrapped in their prayer shawls. A photograph that really conjures the images really of the Nazi atrocities that were yet to come, but also I think gives us echoes of what we've seen with Abu Ghraib and with imperialist armies around the world today. Absolutely chilling stuff. So the Reds won the war. They had to win the war, because if they didn't win the war, this was the sort of society that would have been ushered in. But the cost of the war was huge. The economy in Russia was absolutely devastated, and Russia was, after the war, in a state of absolute social collapse. You can see this on every level. Look at industry. By 1920, industrial output was 31% of the 1913 level. When it came to iron production, it was 3%. Cotton production was 11%. Lots of factories had shut. There were shortages of fuel. There were shortages of raw materials. The workers who were working in the factories were starving. Many of them were forced to go back to the countryside. Look at the cost in terms of population. Hundreds of thousands killed fighting. They reckon 350,000 killed by the war and another 450,000 killed by disease in the conditions that the Civil War created. Look at the impact on the working class. The working class that had made the revolution, who was central to the future of the workers' revolution and the new regime, had been decimated, numerically and politically. The working class at the end of the Civil War had halved in size. This is partly because the people who were the key defenders of the revolution were the workers who'd made it. The first people who went to fight in the hardest battles in the Civil War were the leading working class militants. Many died defending the revolution, or from the hardships that they faced, or left to the countryside in order to find food to survive. The Bolsheviks were the most militant sections of the working class, so they were the ones who were most affected by this. And they themselves played a huge cost in terms of loss of membership and loss of political organisation. And at the end of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks were essentially left running a worker state without the working class intact that had made that revolution. A huge gap had opened up, not through anybody's choice, but through the impact of the Civil War and the impact of what they'd been through. A huge gap had opened up between the party and the class that it was part of and that it had represented and that had made the revolution. This impacted on everybody, on all of society. But winning the Civil War had been crucial. The Bolsheviks had no choice about this. They couldn't just hand power back. And that had meant subjugating all aspects of the economy during the Civil War to the war effort. That had meant the priority had to be feeding starving workers and soldiers. And that meant taking some measures that they ideally didn't want to do. For example, taking grain, often forcibly, from the peasants. This wasn't part of the programme that they'd set out to do. The Bolsheviks would have much rather been able to bind peasants to the future of the workers' revolution by exchanging goods for grain, but they didn't have the time or the luxury to do this. People had to be fed, the grain was taken. State control at this time was widened and centralised, even though there was also a booming black market during what they called war communism. While the war was going on, most peasants still supported the Bolsheviks, or were at least neutral in this, because they knew what the alternative was. But as the war was ending, there were increasing revolts in the countryside against the grain requisitioning and against the conditions that people faced, and revolts among other groups too. The most significant of these probably, and subsequently the most well-known, is the revolt at Kronstadt, where the naval fortress just outside Petrograd, that had been absolutely key in the October Revolution, rose up in protest at the conditions that people faced. The revolt at Kronstadt was violently suppressed by the Bolsheviks, with huge losses on both sides, lots and lots of blood loss. Trotsky at the time, and Chris Harman later in the article that I referred to, argued that what had happened at Kronstadt was the social make-up, and so the class consciousness of the sailors had changed, that a lot of the sailors who'd made the revolution had been killed, had fought, and been replaced by less class-conscious sailors who were less wedded to the revolution. Now, there is some truth to this if you look at who made up the sailors at the time, but I don't think this is the key point about what happened in Kronstadt, because the revolt at Kronstadt expressed genuine concerns and grievances of people who were really genuinely suffering. But the problem is that their demands essentially would have meant abandoning the revolution. And the whites who looked to Kronstadt certainly knew this. And the Bolsheviks ultimately had no choice. What was at stake was the survival of the revolution. And this is why lots of people who had lots of reservations about this, including Victor Serge, an anarchist who joined the revolution and left a brilliant account of this whole period of time, actually said that the Bolsheviks had no choice but to do what they did. And I want to say a couple of other things, really. I haven't really got time to talk about the controversy around the terror and the repression around the Bolsheviks, but it's often used to try and say that there is proof that Lenin's leadership led to the vicious repression that we saw under Stalin. But it's important to understand that the terror that existed under Lenin and the early Bolsheviks was a response to the situation that they faced. And this is why it varied depending on the level of threat that they faced. If you read the early days of the Civil War, straight after the October Revolution, the workers felt strong. They felt in control. They felt buoyed up by the revolution. When they arrested people who wanted to attack the revolution, they normally gave them a big telling off and got them to sign a pledge to say that they'd never do it again, and then they let them go. You might say naively, I would say naively personally, because lots of these people then came back and tried to attack the revolution. But it depended on the level of threat. So as the level of threat deepened and the revolution was more in danger, the level of response that was needed grew in turn. So the Red Terror was decreed in 1918 in response to atrocities by the whites in Finland and in response to a number of assassination attempts, including one on Lenin himself that nearly killed him. In 1920, there was an attempt to relax the terror, but the war in Poland again meant it was ramped up. Now, I haven't got time to talk about the various controversial measures. If people want to talk about them, let's talk about them, because it's important that we discuss, I think, controversial aspects of what happened, that we're able to come to some decisions about that. But there was lots of controversial methods and things that were done, and there were many innocent people who were undoubtedly caught up in the Red Terror. And there was a recognition of this after the Civil War, when the notorious Cheka, the political police, was abolished in an attempt at more kind of normalisation of the political situation. But we have to remember that the terror that existed under the Reds was different, both in scale, in nature, and in purpose to what came from those hostile to the revolution, both from the whites, and I've given a hint of some of the atrocities that the whites carried out, with their mass slaughter and their pogroms, but also later the persecution that came and the terror that came from the Stalinist regime. But I want to go back to Russia, if you excuse the phrase. Let's go back to Russia. At the end of the Civil War, where the economy was devastated, there was massive unemployment and dislocation, the revolts in the countryside, there were some strikes in Petrograd, there was a rebellion in Kronstadt, the revolution had not spread. I'm not painting a very happy picture here, am I? It was not a happy time, and it was clear to all that a change of policy was needed. The challenge for the Bolsheviks after 1917 had been how to balance between peasants and workers to ensure that the regime could survive, because they wanted it to survive long enough for the revolution to spread. This was always the perspective at this time. But after all the things I've talked about, the Bolsheviks introduced a new economic policy which tipped the balance towards appeasing the peasants. An end of requisitioning of grain, an introduction of market forces to try and encourage peasants to grow more, the introduction of private commodity production, the creation of a new class of traders known as the net men. This period saw a divide in the countryside between rich and poor peasants that was growing. All of these things had an impact, not just on the economy, but on the social fabric of society in Russia at this time. Now, these measures were intended as a temporary retreat by the Bolsheviks, and they gave a bit of breathing space. They relieved a little bit of pressure for a time, but they didn't remove the contradictions that existed, and they would still result in a crisis, which I'm going to come on to, at the end of the period of the new economic policy. It's also important to say that the size of the working class did grow in this period, but it grew slowly. And it took until the end of the 1920s to return to pre-Civil War numbers. And by that time, the political confidence, the organisation, the structures, both formal and informal, that had been central to the revolution, had been lost. And there was no real workers' control to speak of by the end of the new economic policy. There was a degeneration of what remained of democracy in the workplace. So in 1922, 65% of managing personnel in the factories were workers. A year later, that was only 36%. Now, I want to talk about the rise of the bureaucracy and the rise of Stalin, because the two things are absolutely interlinked. And what do I mean by bureaucracy? What is a bureaucracy? A bureaucracy, as we're talking about here, are state officials who are not subject to popular control. And the imperative of war communism and the devastation of the economy after the war forced the state to step in, to, often in ways that they hadn't planned to organise, to centralise, to distribute resources, to repress people who wanted to sabotage the revolutionary regime. And this created a layer of people who were pulled into administration, into work apart from removed from the factories and the work on the land, a separate layer of people, a layer of bureaucracy. And those pulled into this layer, into the administration, were usually the most able, the energetic, and the most politically reliable, because these were urgent tasks. These were tasks of survival of the revolutionary society. There are estimates in Mike Haynes' brilliant book on Russia that 20,000 Bolsheviks a year left their jobs in the factories to join the bureaucracy in the 1920s. So this had an impact not just on society, this growing level of bureaucracy, it had an impact back on the nature of who were in the Bolshevik party in themselves. The bureaucracy was also forced to call on some of the elements of the old state apparatus to help keep things functioning and ticking over. And the bureaucracy rose not as an end in itself. It was never an aim to create a bureaucracy in this way. It resulted as a response to the pressures that the regime was under, and it developed over time through a series of different episodes and different ways of developing, but came to represent a set of interests of its own, and this was the base from which Stalin was to emerge. Stalin was made the General Secretary of the party in April 1922 with an aim to give the party more coherence. And he did this through what were his main skills, which were basically bureaucratic means, removing people, appointing the people that he liked, things like this. It didn't go unnoticed what was happening with the bureaucracy. There were many voices of criticism of the bureaucratization of the regime in Russia. Lenin himself was extremely worried about the bureaucratisation that was happening. In 1923, he described the bureaucracy as deplorable and wretched. And as Lenin's health declined and he suffered a series of strokes from 1922, he also grew increasingly concerned about what Stalin was up to. He left the testament, what is called Lenin's testament, I didn't make that up, calling on the Bolshevik leadership to try and find a way to remove Stalin. But tragically, after Stalin's death in 1924, the Central Committee, worried about opening up Lenin's death, sorry. Yeah, that was my wishful thinking after Stalin's death. We'll discuss this later. This could be the what-ifs, couldn't it? The what-ifs. What if Stalin had lived and... anyway, whatever. Anyway. So, after Lenin's death in 1924 and Stalin resolutely remained alive, the Central Committee were worried about opening up divisions in the party and covered up Lenin's disagreement. And this allowed the still-alive Stalin to claim the mantle of Leninism after Lenin's death. Worse than that, to invent a cult-like feature called Leninism, and then to also go on to create what he created as his opposite, the supposed opposite of Trotskyism that was used to vilify the opposition to Stalin. And if the fate of revolution was always bound to the international situation, it's very important that we talk about how the regime came to adopt the question of socialism in one country, which was an absolute reversal of what the Bolsheviks had stood for. In 1923, a revolutionary crisis in Bulgaria, and then more significantly in Germany, had resulted in defeats for the left, and the sense of isolation fueled the idea that the revolution was isolated, and it fueled the idea of socialism in one country, an idea initially suggested by Bukharin but taken up by Stalin at the party congress in April 1924, when he argued that the victory of socialism is unconditionally possible in one country. And the idea of socialism in one country was seen as a way of focusing on finding internal routes to economic development, of finding solutions to the problem within the borders of Russia. Like I say, it was a complete break with although the full consequences of this only became apparent later, it was a complete break with the ideas that the Bolsheviks had the importance of it spreading. Many nationalist forces, of course, liked the idea of socialism in one country. Mike Haynes quotes how some industrialists felt that Russia was becoming like a radish. It was red on the outside but becoming white on the inside. But Trotsky and the others always insisted that the international revolution was necessary, both to deepen and to spread the revolution. And I haven't got time to talk about in full detail about the nature of the opposition to Stalin, but it's important to say that the rise of the bureaucracy and of Stalin was not a seamless process. It didn't start at one point and just progress seamlessly, but rather through a series of changes and shifts, and each change and shift brought opposition. There are different stages in the opposition to Stalin, and there's lots to say about all of them. I think the key thing for us is that the most consistent critique of Stalin and the most important organiser of opposition to Stalin was Leon Trotsky. And if we have time, we'll talk more about the battle that Trotsky ran. I want to just kind of move towards how Stalin actually took power and the counter-revolution of 1927-1928. Because, as I said, throughout this period, from the Civil War through the new economic policy to a crisis that hit Russia in 1927-1928, there had been qualitative shifts in the degeneration of the revolution. And in 1928, what I want to argue is that those quantitative shifts became a qualitative shift in terms of an actual counter-revolution that wiped out what was remaining of the 1917 revolution. Because the internal and external contradictions of the situation in Russia really came to head in a crisis in 1927-1928. The sense of isolation of the revolution grew following the failure of the 1926 general strike in Britain and the disastrous slaughter, partly because of Stalin's terrible advice in China of revolutionary communists in 1927. 1927 also saw a crisis in food supply due to a poor harvest. It saw industry in crisis due to the ageing, collapsing infrastructure of Russia. A war panic gripped the country after Britain shut down international trade, followed by Canada and others. There was fear of war from Poland. The regime felt vulnerable and under threat. There was an atmosphere of crisis, of disillusionment. There were mass resignations from the party. And Stalin and the bureaucracy implemented a series of ad hoc measures to try and address this crisis. And, Stalin was no genius. People, the most important historians of the revolution described him at the time in 1917 as a grey blur. But Stalin came to represent one social class, the one social layer in Russia at that time that had the ability and the political will to force its way out of the crisis. The peasants could resist, and they had resisted at various points, but they couldn't lead a coherent political struggle. The working class was devastated and politically weak in the ways that I talked about, although it did put up an impressive surge of opposition. And I really recommend Kevin Murphy's book on the factories in Moscow, on metal workers in the factories. If you want to read more about that opposition, Michael Ryman, in his book on the rise of Stalinism, describes it as opposition activity was spreading like a river in flood. However, support for the opposition was too passive to actually have any impact on the direction of the regime. The bureaucracy turned out to be the only class that could use its power to impose a direction on society. And that was done in the most brutal way and at the cost of both the peasants and the workers. And in the face of international and economic military competition, Stalin saw the need to drive up industrial production, and he was willing to do this regardless of human cost. His first 5-year plan, which involved forced he called collectivisation of the peasantry, which was mass disappropriation of the peasantry. There was massive exploitation in the factory, tight centralised control of the economy, consolidation of power in the bureaucracy, a destruction of all that remained of any kind of democratic grassroots organisation. And this was a reflection of Stalin's acceptance of living within the confines of a global market and the need to compete militarily and economically in a capitalist world. And once that was accepted, a huge catch-up was needed. If you think about the changes that happened in Western Europe, it took 200 years to industrialise, and with all the brutality that involved in Western Europe, this was condensed into a decade in Russia. And Stalin explained this logic in a speech to managers in 1931. He said, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this lag in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us." And so by 1928, the bureaucracy had transformed itself into a class not just for itself, but but also a class for itself. It had transformed from a class in itself to a class for itself, a self-conscious class ruling over others in a capitalist world, a collective capitalist ruling class, in a system that Tony Cliff, who founded the SWP, described as state capitalism. And we can say more about this if people want to. I'm going to finish now before the chair pushes me off the table. Was it inevitable? No, it wasn't inevitable. There were lots of what-ifs. I've raised some of them. What if Stalin had died instead of Lenin? That's a new one. What if could Trotsky have won? Trotsky made lots of mistakes. Trotsky was often too conciliatory. He made concessions often in order to preserve the unity of the opposition. He was hampered by a lack of clear understanding that the bureaucracy were becoming a new collective ruling capitalist class. But it's much easier for us to see that in hindsight than it was for anybody in Russia at that time to understand what was happening. Trotsky was more impressive than Stalin on every single measure that you could look at what he wrote, at what he said, at the things he did, all of those things. But the battle wasn't between individuals, it was between social forces. And without international revolution, Trotsky was bound to lose. Trotsky knew this. He wrote in 1940 that there was no question of the left opposition coming to power without a revolutionary upsurge. And the crucial question, and the real what if, was the spreading of the revolution. And that was not inevitable. It was not inevitable that the wave of revolt that hit across Europe, beyond Europe, into the colonies and around the world at the time of the Russian Revolution was doomed to failure. And if there are some things that we have to learn from this, we have to take the lessons of the Bolsheviks, we have to stand firm to the principles of socialism from below, to internationalism, and we have to strengthen and build revolutionary organisation in every corner of the globe and everywhere that we live, because without revolutionary organisation, there is no chance to spread revolutions, and there's no chance to win revolutions.